The desert doesn't give a man much, but it will strip him clean. Out here, there are no crowds, no chatter, no faces to remind me of what I lost. Just wine scraping across the flats, sun hammering down on my back, and the sound of a mule's hooves steady as a heartbeat. My name's Jonas Creel, and for near on 2 years, I've lived with nothing but this wagon, this trail, and silence. Before I tell you what I found out there, don't forget, like this story, leave a comment about where you're watching from and follow the channel so you don't miss the rest. Every word you share helps keep these Wild West stories alive. Now, the truth is, I didn't come to the desert for work. Hauling freight just gives me a reason to keep moving. Folks at the depots think I'm dependable because I don't waste time in saloons, don't play cards, don't stir trouble. What they don't know is I can't stomach the sound of people asking questions anymore. Last time a man asked about my wife, I nearly put him through the door. The time before, someone asked if I still had my boy. I don't. The memory of that winter still burns in me. My wife took sick, and the doctor was late. My son, Eli, followed her into the ground before the frost broke. After that, I sold the ranch, bought a mule, and quit trying to live like other men. So I take the long roads now, the quiet ones, where no one recognizes me. On this trip, the main bridge west had washed out from the rains, so I cut east through the dry basins north of Red Washington. It meant more days under the sun, more nights camped by myself. But that suited me fine. I've found a strange comfort in silence. At least silence doesn't ask for answers I can't give. The heat that day was the kind that doesn't just sit on your skin but climbs into your lungs, makes every breath taste of dust. My shirt clung to me, damp along the spine. I could hear Cora, my mule, snorting as she pulled us along, her ears twitching against flies. I didn't push her harder than she could take. Freight wasn't worth dying for, and I had no one waiting on me at the end of the road anyway. I thought it would be a day like all the others. A man gets used to the desert's emptiness. You start believing nothing can break that wide horizon, that nothing human survives out here long. Then the wind shifted, just a faint stirring, but enough to carry a smell that didn't belong. Not rot exactly, not death, but something that tightened my chest. My hand tugged at the reins and I leaned forward, scanning the flats. There wasn't anything but brittle brush, and the line of distant ridges wavering like heat smoke. Still, my gut told me not to ignore it. At first I told myself it was nothing, just the desert playing tricks on a man too long alone. But then I saw it, a shape, low in the sand, small against the stretch of earth. I squinted, thinking maybe it was a rock or a busted fence post left half buried from some old trail, but number. The closer we rolled, the less it looked like the desert and the more it looked like something else, something alive. I stopped the wagon, let the reins fall slack, and climbed down. My boots sank into the hot dirt, and every step closer set my heart to hammering harder. By the time I stood over it, I knew it was a head, a woman's head, dark hair matted, face scorched red by sun, buried up to her neck in the sand. For a moment, I thought she was gone. The flies circled too thick, her lips split and still. But then I saw it, a flicker. Her chest rose just enough to count. I froze there, my throat tight, hands cold despite the heat. Someone had done this to her, deliberate, cruel. They'd left her for the desert to finish. I looked around for horses' tracks, a camp, nothing, just her and me. The sight of it twisted something in me I hadn't felt since the day I laid my boy in the ground. I knelt beside her, pressed 2 fingers to her throat. Her pulse beat faintly, like a bird's wing trapped under stone. My breath shook. I pulled the canteen from my belt, tipped a few drops against her lips. They parted slightly. Her eyes fluttered under lids blistered by sun. She made the smallest sound, barely a twitch, but it was enough. I could have left. A man alone in the desert learns to mind his own. Lord knows I told myself I should. If the ones who buried her came back, I'd be standing over her with nothing but my mule and my rifle. But the truth is, I couldn't walk away. Not from this. Not after all I'd already lost. I've carried too many graves behind me. The desert has taken its share. I wasn't about to let it take hers, so I set my hands to digging. The sand was hard packed, burned my palms raw, filled my nails with grit until they bled. I didn't stop. Every few minutes, I pressed more water against her lips, careful not to choke her, watching the faint rise of her chest with each swallow. It felt like clawing someone back from death itself. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know why she'd been left to die this way. All I knew was she was still breathing, and as long as she was, I wasn't letting her slip away. I thought I'd seen enough of death to keep me from being rattled. The war, the fever that swept through the valley, the shallow graves I dug with my own hands when the earth froze too hard to give easily, all of it should have steeled me. But when I came up on her, buried in the ground with only her head showing, my chest hollowed out in a way I hadn't felt in years. She wasn't supposed to be there. No human should be left like that. The desert's cruel enough, without men deciding to play executioner. I stood over her for what felt like forever, my boots sinking an inch into the sand, sweat sliding down my back, even though my skin felt cold. The sun poured down like molten iron, and her face had taken the worst of it. The skin was blistered and cracked, flies buzzing at the corners of her lips. Her eyes stayed closed, lashes clumped with dust. But then I saw it. Her chest moved shallow, but enough. That flicker of life grabbed me by the throat. I dropped to my knees, pressed 2 fingers against her neck, and felt that faint pulse stuttering beneath the heat of her skin. She was burning up, her body cooking in the ground like the desert was already claiming her. My hand shook when I pulled my canteen free, uncapped it, and let a few drops touch her lips. At first, nothing happened. Then her mouth parted just slightly, like she was chasing water in a dream. I tilted again, careful, whispering low without thinking, "Easy now, don't choke." She made a sound, something broken and small, but it was enough to tell me she was still fighting. I didn't waste another breath. I set my hands into the sand and began tearing at it like a madman. The ground was hard, packed tight by wind and sun, and every clawed handful scraped my palms raw. Dirt wedged under my nails until I bled. I didn't care. I dug like a man who couldn't stop because maybe I was. With every handful of sand thrown aside, I thought of Eli, my boy, the way his little chest had gone still in the dead of winter when no digging had been enough to save him. I couldn't save him, but I could save her. The minutes stretched like hours, my breath ragged, sweat dripping into my eyes. Sometimes I stopped long enough to give her another taste of water. Her lips twitched, her throat worked, and each swallow lit a small spark in me. I kept at it, stripping the desert back piece by piece until my fingers struck the fabric of her blouse, torn and stiff with dirt. I pulled harder, freeing her arms, her shoulders, each inch of her body emerging like she'd been born into the world all over again. When I finally lifted her out, she weighed next to nothing. Bones under skin, light as a child. I held her close, careful, as I carried her back to the wagon, her head lolled against my chest, eyes opening for the briefest second. They were dark, unfocused, but wide with something fear, maybe, or just the body remembering it was still alive. Then they closed again, and she sagged against me like she had no strength left. I laid her across the canvas in the wagon bed, tucking one of my blankets around her. Her skin burned hot, and I thought about the old stories I'd heard, the desert trials, the punishments tribes handed down when they said someone brought shame. I never believed I'd come across it myself, but here she was, left to die slow under the open sky. My gut tightened, anger curling low. Whoever buried her wanted her forgotten. Climbing back onto the bench, I flicked the reins gently, urging Cora forward. The wagon creaked as it rolled on, every mile feeling like it mattered. I found myself looking back at her over my shoulder more than I watched the road. Her chest rose in shallow pulls, her lips twitching now and again like she was caught between this world and another. Each breath she drew made me feel something I hadn't in a long time: purpose. By the time the sun began to fall, bleeding orange across the flats, I pulled us into the shelter of a dry creek bed. I made camp fast, stacking brush for a fire, laying a tarp flat on the ground. I carried her from the wagon and set her there, easing my coat under her head for a pillow. She didn't stir, didn't make a sound, but her fingers clutched faintly at the blanket I wrapped her in. It near broke me, that small motion. The way even half dead she still held on. That night, I didn't close my eyes. I sat by the fire, knees bent, rifle across my lap, and watched the rise and fall of her chest. Sometimes it paused too long, and I leaned forward, whispering low, just to remind her the world was still here. I didn't have words worth much anymore, but I gave her sound, steady and close, because no one deserves to die in silence. I thought about my wife then, the way her breath had slowed in that last hour, the way my boy's small hand had gone limp in mine. I thought about how I'd run from every reminder since, telling myself I was finished with saving anyone. But here was this woman, left for the desert to claim, and I couldn't ride on. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was mercy. Maybe it was just the last bit of humanity in me refusing to give up. Whatever it was, it kept me there, wide-eyed and raw, feeding her beans softened in the fire, pressing water to her lips, waiting for her to come back. And when her eyes finally opened, just a sliver, catching the firelight for the first time, I felt something move inside me I thought had died with my family. She wasn't gone, and as long as she breathed, neither was I. The first night I sat up beside her, the fire snapping low and the desert cold crawling in, I thought maybe she wouldn't make it until dawn. Her breathing came ragged, shallow, with long pauses that made my own lungs tighten. I leaned in every so often, putting my hand near her mouth just to feel that faint warmth. Each time it returned, it steadied me. I kept whispering low sounds, nothing with meaning, just a voice to fill the dark, because silence felt too close to death. When the sun came up, the world was sharp and empty again, but she was still with me. I brewed coffee, the smell rich and bitter, and softened a few beans until they near turned to paste. I spooned them slow, pressing against her lips. The first time she gagged, I worried I'd killed her myself. But I tried again, careful as I could, and she swallowed. That small swallow felt like a victory. I told her, "That's it, you're doing fine." She didn't open her eyes, didn't answer, but her throat worked, and that was enough to keep me going. I remembered another winter years back, when I held a spoon to my boy's lips the same way, trying to get broth down him when fever had already stolen his strength. He never swallowed, more than once or twice. I buried him a week later. That memory stung like hot iron. But this time it was different. She was fighting, even half gone as she was. 2 days passed in that creek bed. I moved the wagon only a mile north before making camp again, afraid a long ride would finish her off. I kept her in the shade, laid wet cloth across her brow, gave her water in drops. Her skin cooled a little, though the heat still radiated off her like fire. I barely slept, only dozed with my rifle across my lap, each sound in the night pulling me awake. I didn't know who had buried her, or if they'd come looking to see if the desert had done their work. I wasn't about to let them find her helpless again. She hadn't spoken a word, hadn't looked at me once with clear eyes. Sometimes I thought I was keeping alive nothing more than a shell, but then she'd grip at the blanket with those trembling fingers, or her lips would twitch against the water I gave, and I knew there was someone still in there. On the second evening, I set a windbreak with the canvas and crates, laid her against a pack so she could sit propped instead of flat. She shifted on her own then, slow and weak, but deliberate. I watched her eyes flutter open for the briefest moment before sinking shut again. I crouched nearby and asked in a low voice, "You got a name?" Nothing. Her face didn't change, lips dry and still. I sighed, sat back, and let it be. It was later that night, the fire burning low, that I heard her voice. A rasp at first, almost too faint to catch. I leaned closer, thinking she was moaning, but then the word shaped clearer. Sonnie. My chest tightened. I repeated it softly. Sonnie. She swallowed and whispered again. My name. Sonnie. For a long time I just stared at her, the firelight trembling across her face. A name was more than I'd expected. A name meant she wasn't just a body I'd pulled out of the sand. It meant she was someone with a story, someone who still belonged to the living. I nodded steady. Jonas, I said. Jonas Creel. Her eyes opened, just barely flickering toward me before closing again. That was all. But it was enough to carve deep inside me. From that moment, the silence between us changed. It wasn't the empty kind anymore. It was waiting. The next morning, she tried sitting up when I handed her a tin cup of water. Her hands shook so hard I thought she'd drop it. But she managed to drink on her own. She let out a breath after, weak but steady. And I caught myself almost smiling. It had been years since I'd had reason to. I gave her a clean shirt of mine to replace the torn blouse she wore, turned my back so she could change, listening to the small rustle of fabric. When she came out of the wagon, wrapped still in my blanket, she walked slow but upright, her steps unsteady like a colt learning its legs. I couldn't help watching her. The desert had near buried her, but here she was, moving through it alive. I didn't press her with questions, though my head swarmed with them. Who had done this? Why had they left her? What kind of people called this justice? But I could see the marks on her skin, the bruises fading at her shoulder, the raw scrape across her collarbone. I knew cruelty when I saw it. She'd been broken before she ever touched that sand. That evening we sat across from each other, firelight between us. She didn't eat much, just a few beans, but she whispered a hoarse thank you when she set the tin aside. It startled me. Oh, Kaan, that's soft gratitude, like a crack opening in stone. I nodded once. You're safe, I told her. Safe. It was a word I hadn't used in years, not since I lost my family and gave up on the notion. But watching her wrapped in my blanket, eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet alive, I meant it. Maybe I didn't know who I was keeping her safe from, but I knew I would. That night, as she lay in the wagon under canvas, I stayed outside by the fire. My rifle rested across my knees, my eyes on the horizon. Every time the flames snapped, I thought about how close I'd come to riding past her, how easy it would have been to let the desert do what it does best. But I hadn't, and now there was no turning back. I wasn't sure what lay ahead, or how long she'd stay. I only knew this: she was alive because I stopped, and as long as she breathed, I wasn't letting her slip back under the sand. For days she barely spoke, and I didn't press her. I knew silence could be a kind of wound, the sort that doesn't show on skin but runs deep where no doctor's hand can reach. She drank water when I gave it, ate a little when I coaxed her with beans softened in broth, but her eyes stayed shuttered most of the time, drifting between waking and something else. I kept my distance when I could, yet I never strayed far. Part of me told myself it was duty. I'd found her, I couldn't just let her fade. But if I was honest, there was more. Keeping watch over her steadied me in a way the trail never had. By the third night, I built camp near a dry arroyo. I laid her against a pack, wrapped in my coat, and sat across from her while the firelight flickered low. The desert stretched quiet all around us, but in that glow, the silence between us felt different, not empty but waiting. I stirred the coals with a stick, then looked her way. "You got a name?" I asked softly. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She lowered her gaze, eyes shadowed, and I let it be. I told myself not to expect anything, not yet. Still, I kept talking to her in short pieces when the quiet grew too heavy. Little things. How far we had to travel. What wood burns hotter. How I once patched a wagon wheel in the middle of a storm. My voice was rough from disuse, but it filled the air enough that she'd know I was there. That mattered more than the words themselves. It was the next evening, with the fire snapping low and a cold wind coming off the flats, that I finally heard her. I just handed her a tin of water, steadying her shaking hands as she lifted it to her mouth. She sipped slow, set it aside, and for a long moment only stared at the flames. Then her voice, hoarse and broken, pushed through the dark. "Sonnie." The sound of it hit me harder than I'd ever admit. I froze, the name echoing in me like a church bell in an empty town. "Sonnie," I repeated, careful not to startle her. She blinked slow, her throat working, as if the word had cost her more than she could spare. "My name," she whispered, voice low as a breath. "Sonnie." I sat quiet, letting it settle between us. It was more than I'd expected, more than I'd hoped for. A name meant she wasn't just a broken body I'd dragged from the dirt. A name meant she was still herself, still tethered to the world. I nodded once, slow and steady. "Jonas," I told her. "Jonas Creel." Her eyes found mine for a heartbeat, dark and weary, then slipped shut again. That glance held more weight than whole conversations I'd had in the past. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me, a stirring I hadn't known in years. For the first time since burying my boy, I cared to remember a name. From then on, the silence changed. It wasn't the hollow kind anymore. It was heavy with something new, as though words might come if we waited long enough. She still spent most of her hours wrapped in the blanket, dozing or staring at the sky, but when I offered water, her fingers gripped the cup instead of letting it slide. When I handed her food, she ate on her own. Each small act reminded me she was choosing to live. I kept close but gave her room. Sometimes I caught myself just watching, studying the way her hands trembled less each day, the way she leaned toward the fire for warmth, the way her lips moved faintly when she thought I wasn't looking, as if she were trying to remember how to form words again. I never asked what haunted her. That would come when she was ready. One evening after the sun had bled out behind the ridges and left only ash-colored sky, she surprised me again. She shifted closer to the fire, tugged the blanket tighter, and whispered rough as gravel, "Thank you." My breath hitched. It was only 2 words, but they rooted me to the ground. I shook my head. "Don't thank me," I said. She looked at me then, her eyes shining faint in the firelight. And though she didn't speak again, I knew she'd heard me. That night I lay awake longer than usual, the sound of her voice circling in my head. Sonnie. It had a weight, a rhythm, something that settled in me. I thought about all the names I'd stopped saying, my wife, my boy, and how empty my days had been without them. Saying hers felt different. It didn't bring pain. It brought something I hadn't dared to feel in a long time. As I drifted toward sleep, I realized the road had shifted under my boots without me noticing. She wasn't just someone I'd pulled from the sand anymore. She was a presence, fragile but steady, tethering me to something beyond the ache I'd carried. I didn't know where her path would lead, or mine with it, but I knew this much. Her name was Sonnie, and now I couldn't turn back. It was near a week before she said more than a few words at a time. By then, her voice had steadied enough that when she spoke, it didn't scrape raw like it had before. Most nights we sat across from each other with the fire between us, letting the silence fill itself. I didn't ask questions, not at first. I'd lived long enough to know a person will tell you what you need to hear when they're ready. Still, I could see it pressing on her, the weight behind her eyes, the way her jaw set when I so much as asked if she wanted more water. That night the wind came hard across the flats, carrying dust like ash. I'd built the fire high, braced canvas against a crate to break the gusts. She sat wrapped in my blanket, hair loose and dark against her face, eyes fixed on the flames. I stirred the pot with a stick, beans softening slow. Then I asked, not harsh, just steady, "Who did that to you?" For a while, I thought she wouldn't answer. The crackle of the fire was the only sound, the shadows shifting across her face. Then her voice came low, hoarse but clear. "My mother's husband." She didn't lift her eyes, only stared deeper into the flames. The others listened to him. I held still, my hand tight around the spoon. "What did they say you'd done?" Her lips trembled once, but she didn't cry. Her voice was flat, like she'd told herself this story 100 times already in her own head. A girl, she was young, beaten for walking near the edge of camp. I said it was wrong. I didn't fight. I didn't shout. I just said it. She paused, breath catching. That was enough. My chest burned hot, anger rising, steady and sharp. I'd seen cruelty before, men dressing it up as law, twisting words to make themselves feel righteous. But hearing it laid out from her mouth, quiet and steady, tore something loose in me. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, staring at the ground between us. "And your mother?" Sonnie's voice thinned until it was almost a whisper. She didn't say anything, just stood there. She swallowed, her eyes glinting in the firelight, hard and brittle. That told me everything I needed to know. I let the silence sit between us, though my jaw clenched so hard it ached. She looked up at me then, and there was no pleading in her eyes, no softness. Just the raw truth of someone who'd been abandoned by the very blood that should have protected her. "He said it was old law," she went on, voice like stone, "that if a woman caused disorder, she could be buried. He told them I was a threat to unity." My hand tightened around the stick until it snapped in two. I tossed it into the fire, sparks spitting up. I'd heard stories of that kind of punishment, whispered tales from broken camps, but I never thought I'd come across someone who'd lived through it. It made me sick. The thought of those men standing around listening to her scratch out a single word of protest and calling that enough to bury her alive. I looked at her long, steady. Do they know you're alive? She shook her head once. You want them to? For a long time she didn't answer. Her gaze drifted to the flames, the muscles in her jaw tight. Finally she said, No. That word cut clean through me. Not fear, not hesitation, but choice. She wasn't looking to be taken back, wasn't asking for anyone's mercy. She'd already chosen her own grave, and I just happened to pull her from it. The fire popped, and the wind hissed through the brush. My blood still burned with anger, hot enough I had to breathe slow to keep it down. I thought of my wife, of my boy, of how quick life could be stolen, even when you fought with everything in you. And then I thought of Sonnie, buried because she dared to speak truth, left to bake under the sun like she wasn't even human. Rage curled tight in my chest, steady and cold, the kind that doesn't fade. She shifted then, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, eyes still locked on the fire. I could see her shoulders trembling, not from weakness, but from holding herself together. She wasn't asking me for comfort. She didn't need my pity. She needed someone to hear her, to see her, and to believe her word was enough. I leaned back, rubbing a hand over my jaw, my voice low when I finally spoke. Then we don't let them find you. Her eyes lifted, meeting mine across the fire. For the first time since I dug her from the sand, there was something steady in her gaze, like she believed me. She gave the faintest nod, then turned back to the flames. That night she slept inside the wagon, not just from the cold, but because I wanted her under cover, out of sight from any rider who might pass. I sat outside with my rifle staring into the dark, my hands still restless with fury. I didn't know if those men would ever come hunting, but I promised myself, if they did, they'd never lay eyes on her again. I've carried a lot of anger in my life. Anger at doctors who came too late, at winters that froze the ground too hard for digging, at God himself for taking my family. But this rage was different. It wasn't born out of grief. It was born out of fire, the kind that doesn't die until justice is done. And as I watched Sonnie sleep beneath the canvas, her breath steady now, I knew this much. Whatever came, I wasn't leaving her for the desert again. Not them, not the sand, not anyone. By the time we reached the pass, 4 days had stretched behind us like 4 years. Sonnie was stronger now, though still too thin, her steps careful whenever she climbed from the wagon to warm herself by the fire. She didn't ask where I was taking her, and I didn't say. Truth is, I wasn't sure myself until the cabin came into view. I'd thought of riding past, keeping her with me until she found somewhere else to go. But when that roofline appeared low in the gully, silvered by sun and patched with tar and canvas, I knew there was no point pretending. That cabin was all I had, and if she was to have a chance at living, it was where she needed to be. Cora pulled the wagon slow down the slope, hooves clopping against rock. I set the brake near the split rail pen and climbed down. The air was cooler there, shaded by the hills, and the smell of cedar smoke from the last fire still clung faintly to the boards. For a moment, I just stood, looking at it with her beside me. I'd built the place to hold 3 once, but for 2 years, it had been nothing but walls for a man and his ghosts. Sonnie stayed seated in the wagon, her blanket pulled around her shoulders. Her eyes moved over the place like she was taking measure. I saw her gaze pause on the rain barrel under the eaves, the neat stack of chopped wood by the door, the fence line mended tight against strays. Nothing fancy, but everything set in order, because order was all I'd had to lean on. I wondered then what she saw, whether she thought of it as shelter or just another cage. When I brought water to the mule and unbuckled the harness, she eased herself down from the wagon bed without waiting for me. Her legs wavered but held, and I didn't offer a hand. She liked it that way. She followed me to the porch, her steps slow, her face unreadable as she looked at the small, square window stretched with oil paper, at the door worn smooth from my hand pushing it open each morning. I paused, holding the latch. "You can take the bed," I said. Her eyes flicked past me. Inside was bare, one cot with a wool blanket, a table, 2 chairs, shelves with dried beans and flour, a stove cut from an old barrel. On the far wall hung the drawing I'd done of Eli, my boy, pencil faded, but still clear enough to show the curve of his small smile. She stepped in like a shadow, slow and deliberate, her gaze taking in every corner. "And you?" she asked quietly. "I'll build another cot. Got lumber in the shed." She nodded, set her blanket folded at the foot of the bed. And that was that. No more questions, no hesitation. She'd accepted the space as though it had already been waiting for her. That evening we worked side by side without saying much. She swept the floor with the old broom leaning in the corner, the bristles worn near to nothing. I cleaned out the stove, scraping ash until it rang hollow. When I laid the first boards for the new cot, she brought nails without being asked. There was a rhythm to it, like we'd done this before, though I knew we hadn't. We ate beans and cornbread by lamplight, the room small but warm. Her hands moved careful over her tin plate, steady in the glow, and for the first time the cabin didn't feel like a tomb. It felt lived in again, though I didn't dare name that out loud. Later, as the night pressed in and the wind rattled against the boards, she sat at the edge of the cot I'd given her. The firelight carved her face in half, shadow and glow. She spoke soft, almost to herself. "It doesn't feel like a place for one anymore." I looked up from where I sat, sharpening my knife. My chest tightened, but I only said, "Not anymore." When the lamp burned low, I rolled my bedroll out on the floor near the stove. She lay back against the cot, pulling the blanket to her chin. For a long time we said nothing, only listened to the creak of the roof and the breath of the night pressing through the cracks. I watched the glow dim until it was nothing but embers. And in that silence I felt something I hadn't in years. Not peace, not yet, but the first stirring of it. In the morning I was outside with the saw before the sun crested the ridge. She joined me soon after, moving careful but determined. I told her there was coffee on the stove, but she shook her head and picked up the other end of the beam I was working. I didn't argue. We set it across the sawhorse, my hand steadying the cut, hers bracing it down. The rhythm of labor filled the air, simple and grounding. It reminded me of days long gone, when another pair of hands moved beside mine with the same quiet certainty. Only this time, it didn't hollow me out. It steadied me. That evening, sitting on the porch steps, she pulled the blanket tight around her shoulders and stared out at the ridge. "It feels like I can breathe here," she said. Her voice carried a weight, the kind you don't use unless you mean every word. I didn't look at her, just kept my eyes on the fading sky. "Then you stay as long as you want." The crickets started up in the brush, and the wind softened through the trees. She didn't answer, but her shoulders eased, and for the first time since I'd pulled her from the sand, I saw her settle into herself. That night, when I lay on my cot, I listened to her breathing across the room. It was steady now, not ragged or broken. The sound filled the space more than the fire ever had. I closed my eyes, and though ghosts still lingered, they felt farther off, as though her presence kept them at bay. The nights in the cabin were long, and sometimes the silence inside felt thicker than the walls themselves. I'd grown used to that silence, let it keep me company after I lost my wife and boy. But with Sonnie there, it was different. It wasn't the hollow quiet of grief anymore, but something that pressed, waiting to be filled. We didn't speak much those first weeks. We worked side by side in the day, then sat across from each other by the fire at night, letting the crackle of wood say what neither of us could. Still, I could see it in her eyes. She carried her past the way I carried mine, tucked in deep, raw as any wound, but heavy enough to pull her shoulders down. One evening, while the wind whistled faint through the gaps in the wall and the lamp's glow flickered across her face, she broke the silence. Her voice was low, steady but sharp. My father died when I was young. Cavalry rode through. They called it a mistake, wrong encampment. He was the only one shot. He was sitting down. She didn't look at me when she spoke. Her gaze was fixed on the fire, her hands folded tight in her lap. I felt my chest clench. I'd heard those stories before. Men riding through camps and leaving ruin behind, then calling it error. They always said mistake, as if that made the dead any less gone. After a moment, she went on. My mother remarried. Her new husband, he wasn't like my father. He talked loud, hit harder, said pain made people loyal, said it kept bloodlines strong. Her jaw set tight, her eyes hard as stone. I kept quiet for years. But when he beat that girl, just a child, I said it wasn't right. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't fight, I just said it. That was enough for him to say I was dangerous. I stared into the fire, my throat tight, my hands curled into fists on my knees. I'd buried men for less than that during the war. And here she was telling me how her own kin turned on her for speaking truth. I wanted to spit into the flames, wanted to curse those men, but I didn't. Instead, I said, "No one defended you?" Her silence was its own answer. Then, soft as ash, she said, "Even my mother wouldn't look at me." And that hit me like a hammer to the chest. To be cast out by your own blood, buried alive by the people meant to keep you safe. It was a cruelty I couldn't measure. And yet here she sat, her voice steady, her face calm, carrying the story without letting it crush her. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The fire popped, shadows stretching across the room. I finally set my elbows on my knees and said quietly, "I lost mine too. Wife took sick in the winter, doctor came too late. My boy, Eli, he followed her a month after. I couldn't bury him proper. Ground was frozen solid. Had to wait until spring." The words scraped raw on my tongue. I hadn't said them out loud in months, maybe longer. But the way she listened, her dark eyes fixed on me with no pity, no judgment, only steady witness. It made it easier than I'd expected. Her face softened, her voice low. I'm sorry." I shook my head. "You didn't do it. Don't be sorry." The firelight flickered between us, warm, against the weight of those truths. Two people carved up by loss, sitting across from each other with scars showing for the first time. I'd thought speaking of Eli would hollow me out again, but it didn't. Instead, it felt like a hand pressing against a wound that had been bleeding too long, steadying it. She looked at me a long while after that, her eyes searching, then turned back to the fire. I could see her chest rise and fall, slow and measured, like she'd laid down a piece of the weight she carried. I knew the feeling. I felt it myself. Later, as the lamp dimmed and the wind rattled against the boards, I lay on my cot listening to her breathing across the room. It was even now calm, in a way it hadn't been those first nights. I stared at the rafters and thought of how she'd spoken her truth, how I'd given her mine. It wasn't much, not by most reckonings, but it was more than I'd had with anyone since the day I walked away from the ranch. The next morning, when I was outside chopping wood, she came to stand beside me. She didn't say anything, just picked up the smaller hatchet and set to splitting kindling. Her strokes weren't strong, but they were steady. I glanced at her, the sun catching in her hair, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was laboring alone. We didn't need more words that day. The silence between us had changed again. It wasn't the silence of strangers, nor the silence of grief. It was the silence of scars laid bare and understood. And for a man like me, that silence was worth more than any promise spoken aloud. It was a morning colder than most when I brought the rifle out. Frost had gathered along the edges of the fence, the kind that turns grass brittle beneath your boots. Sonnie stood by the shed, her hands tucked under the blanket I'd given her, watching me with that quiet steadiness she carried everywhere. I set the rifle across my knees as I sat on the porch step, oiling the barrel, the smell of grease sharp in the air. For a while she just watched, but I could feel her waiting. I glanced up finally, holding the rifle out. "You know how to shoot?" Her eyes lingered on the weapon, like it was something half familiar, half foreign. "Some," she said softly. I nodded toward the fence line, where I'd stacked a few rusted cans. "Show me." She hesitated, then stepped forward, her hands pulling free from the blanket. She gripped the stock, fingers trembling just a little. I stepped aside, letting her find her stance. She lifted the rifle, sighted along the barrel, and pulled the trigger. The crack split the air sharp and loud, echoing across the valley. The can stayed where it was. She lowered the gun, her mouth a tight line, frustration simmering behind her eyes. I took the rifle back, checked the chamber, then handed it over again. "Try again," I said, steady, no judgment. Her jaw worked, but she lifted it once more. This time her aim held a little longer, her breathing slower. The second shot rang out, and the can toppled off the post, clattering into the dust. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. I didn't smile, didn't clap her on the back, just said, "Better." She glanced at me then, and though her face stayed calm, I caught the faint spark in her eyes, the kind that comes when someone finds a piece of themselves they thought was lost. We kept at it that morning, shot after shot. She missed more than she hit at first, but each pull of the trigger steadied her, carved away at the fear that had followed her from the sand. By the time the sun stood high and warm, she was striking near true with every round. Her shoulders loosened, her stance stronger. When she handed me the rifle at last, her fingers brushed mine, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. I cleaned the gun in silence, letting the weight of the moment sit between us. Pride swelled in me, though I kept it hidden beneath my usual quiet. It wasn't just about hitting a can on a fence post. It was about watching her reclaim something, watching her stand against a world that had tried to bury her. Later, as we sat by the fire, with a pot of beans simmering low, she spoke, her voice thoughtful. "When they buried me, I thought about how helpless I was. how I couldn't lift a hand to save myself. I hated that most of all. She looked at me across the flames, her gaze steady. Now I know I could lift one. I stirred the pot slow, my throat thick. You can, I said simply. The truth was, teaching her to shoot hadn't been just for her. It was for me, too. I'd spent years believing I couldn't save anyone again, not after failing my own family. But seeing her take that rifle, steady her aim, and put fear behind her, it gave me something I thought I'd lost. Hope, maybe. Or just the sense that my hands could still do more than bury. That night when the fire burned low and the cabin creaked against the wind, she touched the edge of my coat as I sat across from her. It wasn't much, just a brush of her fingers against the fabric, but it rooted me to the spot. Her eyes lifted to mine, and she whispered, "I'm not going anywhere." The words struck deeper than she could have known. For 2 years, I'd lived in motion, hauling freight, riding roads that led nowhere, telling myself I was done with belonging. But with her there, steady and sure, the world shifted. I nodded once, my voice quiet but firm. I know. The silence after carried a different weight, not hollow but full. I sat back, watching her across the fire, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to be taken from me. Instead, I felt the ground steady beneath my feet. When we turned in that night, the air colder than before, I lay awake listening to her breathing across the room. It was even calm, and it carried me into sleep. And when morning came, I rose with a feeling I hadn't known in years. Not just duty, not just survival, but purpose. Sonnie wasn't cargo. She wasn't just someone I'd pulled from the sand. She was here, alive, fighting to claim herself again. And I was here beside her, not out of pity, not out of guilt, but because I wanted to be. The thing about silence is that it can hold more than words ever could. By then, Sonnie and I had settled into a rhythm, the kind only born of labor and long days. She mended shirts while I split wood. She stirred beans while I patched harnesses. We didn't need to speak to know where the other would move, and I found I liked it that way. But some nights, when the fire burned low and the quiet pressed in close, I felt something tugging at me, something waiting to be named. It was after one of those shooting afternoons. She'd been hitting true, knocking cans off posts with a sharp crack. Her stance strong now, her breathing steady. When the sun dropped behind the ridge and left us in that orange haze, she handed me the rifle. Our fingers brushed, and neither of us moved away. Her eyes met mine, dark and unflinching. My chest tightened, not with grief this time, but with something I hadn't let myself feel in years. I set the rifle down slow, careful as if it were glass. She didn't step back. Her hand lifted light against the edge of my coat. That small touch carried more weight than any embrace I'd known. Her voice came low, certain. "I'm not going anywhere." For a heartbeat, I just stared at her, the fire casting her face in half shadow, half glow. I'd spent 2 years drifting, telling myself nothing was worth holding on to. Yet here she was, telling me she'd already chosen to stay. I swallowed, my throat tight, and nodded. I know. The world shifted in that moment. All the roads I'd ridden, the nights I'd spent alone with nothing but ghosts, suddenly they felt like they'd been leading here, to this fire, to this woman, to the choice laid out plain in her words. That night I didn't lay on my cot. I cleared it away, made room, and when she stepped closer, I didn't hold back. We moved slow. No urgency, no fear. Her hand on my chest steadied me. My hand on her shoulder grounded her. There were no declarations, no promises, just the quiet truth of two people who had lost everything and found enough in each other to begin again. Afterward, she lay against me, her forehead resting against my chest, her breath warm and even. The firelight flickered low, shadows crawling across the walls. But inside I felt something stronger than the dark. I brushed my thumb against her arm and whispered, "You don't have to be afraid here." She tilted her head up, her eyes shining in the dim. "I'm not," she said. Then softer, almost like a vow, "Not with you." I held her tighter then, my chest full to the brim. For years I'd carried anger, grief, guilt heavy enough to drown a man. That night, with her pressed against me, the weight lifted just enough to let me breathe. The days after felt different. She moved through the cabin like it was hers, sweeping the floor, hanging a cloth over the window, setting dried herbs on the shelf. I found myself watching her when I thought she wouldn't notice. The way her hair caught in the light, the way her hands moved with quiet purpose. The cabin no longer felt like a place to bury memories. It felt alive again. One evening, as we sat on the porch steps watching the sky burn down into dusk, she leaned her shoulder against mine. "I used to think I was broken," she murmured. I turned, meeting her gaze. "You're not." She breathed out, slow and steady. "You don't even flinch when I talk about what they did." I looked back at the horizon, the ridges fading into night. "I flinch when I imagine leaving you there." She was quiet then, her hand finding mine. For a long time we just sat, our fingers lace, the air cool around us. That simple touch carried a weight no words could reach. That night, when we returned inside, she curled against me before the fire. I listened to her breathing, steady and sure, and felt something anchor in me. She wasn't passing through, wasn't a shadow I'd lose with the morning light. She had chosen, and so had I. I thought of Eli then, my boy, and how I'd believed I'd never let myself love again because of the ache it left. But love isn't something you choose to bury. It finds its way back, even through the hardest ground. Sonnie was proof of that. Lying there with her head on my chest, I whispered what I hadn't dared in years. "You're home now." She stirred, her voice soft but firm. "So are you." I closed my eyes, my hand resting over hers, and let the truth of that settle deep. For the first time since the winter I lost everything, I wasn't alone. The road had ended here, not in silence, not in grief, but in the choice of two people who'd decided not to run anymore. Spring has a way of softening even the hardest ground. By the time the frost broke, the snow melted slow off the ridge, and the first shoots of green pushed stubborn through the earth near the fence line. I realized I'd been given something I thought I'd buried alongside my family, a second chance at belonging. The cabin looks the same from the outside, same patched roof, same silvered boards, same split rail pen. But the truth is, it isn't the same at all. Inside, there's laughter now, soft and low, sometimes just the way Sonnie hums under her breath when she stirs a pot. Sometimes in the way she teases me when I track mud across the floor. There's warmth beyond the fire, a steadiness that comes from more than wood and kindling. Sonnie has taken to the soil behind the cabin, marking out a square for beans, onions, and herbs. She kneels there in the mornings, her hands dark with earth, her hair falling forward as she works. And when I watch her, I see a woman who was once left to die, now shaping life out of stubborn ground. I've been mending fences and cutting posts for a new corral, my back aching the way it used to when the ranch was full. But this time, When I come inside and smell bread baking or hear her footsteps across the floor, I don't feel the emptiness I used to. I feel home. Some nights, we sit on the porch steps, side by side, and watch the sky burn down into gold. She leans against me, her head resting near my shoulder, and I remember the night she said, "I'm not going anywhere." I'd carried that weight in me, the fear that everything I touched would slip away, but she's proven it different. She stayed, and by staying, she gave me back the will to stay too. She told me once, quiet as a prayer, I used to think I was broken, and I told her the truth. You're not. I believe it with everything in me. I've seen her stand steady with a rifle, seen her face the memory of men who would have buried her, seen her tend the fire with hands that once trembled. She is not broken. She is the strongest person I know. And me? I've learned that grief doesn't mean your life ends with it. It just carves you hollow until something worth filling it comes along. For me, it was her. One evening, as we sat together inside, the fire low, she laid her hand over her stomach and whispered, I think I might be with child. My heart stilled, then steadied, then swelled in a way I hadn't felt since the day I first held Eli in my arms. Fear came too, sharp and sudden, fear of loss, fear of the past repeating. But when I looked at her, her eyes steady and sure, I felt hope rise stronger than the fear. If it's a boy, she said, I want to name him Eli. My throat closed and I couldn't speak for a moment. Then I nodded. All right, I whispered. And if it's a girl, you choose. She smiled then, soft and certain. Then I will. I've carried a lot of anger in my life. At God, at doctors too late, at the cold ground that wouldn't let me bury my son until spring. But now, when I wake and see Sonnie moving through the cabin, when I hear her humming low as she tends the stove, when I feel her hand slip into mine as we walk the ridge, that anger eases. What I hold now isn't rage, it's gratitude. I've learned that saving someone else can sometimes save yourself. That love doesn't always come with grand words or vows, but in the way you pass a cup, in the way you split wood together, in the way silence turns from emptiness into comfort. She was buried once, left to the desert, but she chose to rise again. And I was buried in my own way, left under the weight of grief. Together, we dug each other out. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Don't turn away from the broken. Don't ride past when someone's left in the dirt. Sometimes all it takes is stopping, just stopping, to change a life, maybe even your own. So here I sit, a man who once believed he'd lost everything, now watching the sun dip low with a woman who made me believe again. My ghosts are still here, I won't pretend otherwise, but they don't haunt me the way they used to. They've made room for something new, for Sonnie, for the child we might soon hold, for the life we're building out of silence and choice. I never thought I'd say this again, but I am home. And I mean it. Before I close, let me ask you, folks, if this story touched you, if you felt the truth in it, take a moment to like the video, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and follow the channel so these Wild West stories can keep riding on. Your voice matters here, just as hers did when she chose to speak. This is Jonas Creel, and this is the life I found when I thought mine was over.